The language barrier is often a thing that goes ignored in most major series, though when it comes to certain parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, it's actually pretty easy to nail down what language is being spoken in-universe to avoid this issue, especially for each specific part. You either have English for parts 1, 6, and 7, Japanese for parts 4 and 8, and of course Italian for part 5. But one part that seems to be the weirdest when it comes to the language barrier is Stardust Crusaders. With its vastly diverse cast of heroes and villains, it leaves me wondering, what is the spoken language of part 3? So before we start the video, I should explain that I know that the series itself is written in Japanese. Thus, in a literal sense, everyone is speaking Japanese. This is why characters will make Japanese puns, even though it doesn't make sense for their character to do so. Hence why Polnareff, a Frenchman, can get confused when Joseph, an Englishman, says something that could be misunderstood in Japanese. It's a fourth wall breaking joke, and jokes and puns like this will be ignored for this video. Because this video isn't about addressing the source material in a literal sense or Araki's writing of JoJo, but more so examining the story from an in-universe perspective. Here's an example of what I mean. Parts like Phantom Blood and Steel Ball Run can easily be nailed down to everyone speaking English. Even though the cast is diversified between Americans, Italians, and other nationalities, the setting is stationary in England or North America, which are both heavily English-speaking regions. Though this doesn't mean that the characters only speak English throughout the part, but it's implied that the way that they communicate with them and the rest of the cast is through English. Now, the same logic can be applied to other parts of JoJo, but one of the parts that doesn't stay stationary is Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. And it's because of this non-stationary aspect of Stardust Crusaders that makes it so hard to determine what the spoken language is right off the bat. Because it starts in Japan and ends in Egypt, all the while making stops through Hong Kong, India, and Pakistan, which are all different locations with all different main languages. And even trying to determine what language the Crusaders speak themselves is difficult, because if you look at the cast, they all come from different nationalities. You have Polnareff the Frenchman, Abdal the Egyptian, Joseph the Englishman, and 2 different Japanese students, not to mention a dog from the Bronx. So it's easy to assume that the language barrier for this part would be quite large, but actually it's a lot smaller than you might first think, because they do have a shared language, and that is English. And this is not just because English is one of the most commonly spoken languages around the world, it's a very common secondary language for everyone in the Crusaders. Even so much so that it's Joseph and Iggy's first language, as they were either born or raised in America. And then you have Jean-Pierre Polnareff, who was born and raised in France, and likely speaks a lot of French, which is one of the few languages that shaped and changed English as we know it. So it's not too hard to assume that Polnareff would pick up English, especially so since he traveled the world in pursuit of his sister's killer. So it's easy to assume that Polnareff would pick up a few languages along his travels. And then you have Muhammad Abdal, who is an Egyptian-born fortune teller, and likely picked up a multitude of languages in order to interact with tourists who visit Egypt. Along with this, it's established that he has a hobby of collecting and reading books, and he works with Joseph and the Speedwagon Foundation, so it's safe to assume that he knows at least basic English. And then you finally have Kakyoin and Jotaro, who are both second-year high school students, and English is a required class for all public Japanese schools. So information like this would be fresh in their minds, and you don't have to worry about the fact that the actual number of Japanese students who retain English ability is kinda low, because we know for sure that Kakyoin and Jotaro know some sort of English, since Jotaro's mother is a full-blooded English speaker, and we know that Kakyoin and Jotaro both had conversations with Dio. Though I keep bringing up the fact that it's fair to assume that everyone knows English in some capacity, I should at least address the theory that it's possible that everyone also knows Japanese. As we know for a fact that Joseph has a little bit of Japanese in him, since even though he hates Japan, he does love his daughter and visits her frequently enough to have an affair with Tomoko Higashikata, which would allow us to assume that Joseph has at least a basic understanding of the Japanese language, since we know for a fact that Joseph can learn things quickly. Along with this, we know that everyone in the Japanese part of Stardust Crusaders is speaking Japanese because it's directly addressed in the dialogue of the characters. So it's safe to assume that Abdal himself can also speak and read Japanese. Him reading Japanese is reinforced by him spending time in the Kujo family library, where all the books would likely be written in Japanese. Though there are characters who don't mesh with this everyone speaking Japanese idea. First, of course, you have Polnareff, who has no real reason to know Japanese outside of it being convenient for the plot, but some would use his misunderstanding beginning of Joseph as an example of him knowing at least a little bit of Japanese, so we'll let that slide for now. But Iggy breaks this mold completely, as he was born and raised in the streets of New York and is quite stubborn, so I doubt he ever cared to learn a second language. Dio doesn't help the case of Japanese speakers either, as much like Jonathan and Joseph, he was born and raised in England, thus his natural dialect would be English. It is possible that Dio picked up a multitude of languages in the short time he was able to roam free throughout the world. One of these languages could have been Japanese, since Keijo Nijimura mentions him by name and uses a term that he uses, but that term is an English one, Stan. And also, he mentions Enya the Hag, who is also mentioned by Yoshihira Kira, and Yoshihira doesn't mention Dio, only talking about Enya being the one who sold him the arrow. So it's actually more likely that Enya acted as a translator for Dio, and Dio didn't actually know Japanese himself. And thus I feel like the safest answer for what language the Stardust Crusaders were speaking on average is English. Though, obviously from time to time they had to use other languages, like in the aforementioned whole time in Japan where they were likely speaking Japanese to each other, and all the while they spent in Egypt, Abdul probably had to do a lot of interpreting. Hell, even Joseph probably tried his hand at some translations. In fact, speaking of Joseph, that raises a good question. What language were they speaking in Battle Tendencies? I guess we'll never know. Hot trick question was actually probably English. 5/8 of JoJo spoke in English. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MannyNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to learn the language of love, not French, that one's kind of lame, well, you can go to buyshimonetta.com and buy yourself a copy of Shimonetta, a boring world where the contrary jokes doesn't exist, and you can learn all about the concept of love.